Slides up. Right, so welcome to this CV 101 workshop with Fair Museum Jobs. So I'm Tom Hopkins. I'm curator of aircraft at the Royal Air Force Museum in my day job, and I'm joined by Louise McAward-White, who is, if I get this correct, a project manager now at the British Film Institute. So those are our day jobs, and we run Fair Museum Jobs as volunteers. So start off with a little bit more about Fair Museum Jobs.
Sorry, I'm just having some too many windows open situation.
I know that feeling. So we're a collective movement of museum professionals who campaign for a better standard of museum recruitment and to make museum labour practices generally fairer. We work off a manifesto for museum recruitment, which we've based on principles of fairness, transparency, and inclusivity. And we use that manifesto to challenge bad practice that falls short of it. We also use it to celebrate good practice and champion some of the fantastic stuff that's happening out there in the museum industry, because it's not all bad by any stretch of the imagination. And we also provide support and advice to the workforce and employers. So this session tonight fits under that third category, really, of developing the sector workforce. If you have the next slide, please. So this is just some of the things that we do. I guess the main focus of what we do is our Twitter account at fair_jobs, which is where we sort of challenge, call out bad practice, try and really put people who are recruiting poorly under the spotlight of public scrutiny, because job descriptions, job adverts, they're all public documents. So it's important that any bad practice isn't hushed under the carpet and we have a full and frank discussion about it. Top right-hand corner is a screenshot from our careers summit that we ran last year. With about 80 sessions, I think, Louise, over 7 days, which is a lot of hard work, but really, really good. And we're hoping to run something similar, but maybe not quite so big later this year.
Key thing to mention there is that summit was in partnership with Gem, who really kindly supported us on that, but also that's where this session came from. So we ran a careers session as part of that, and what we established was actually what was missing was a really like CV 101, CV basics, and that's what this will cover for you. And then people can graduate onto our CV panel discussion, which we can link to in the chat later as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've definitely identified a need in the summit to do a sort of more basic CV workshop, which is this. We also write articles and we maintain a blog as well, where we sort of develop more like policy ideas and try and do advocacy as well to really put meat towards the arguments that otherwise are lost on the nuance and the character limit on Twitter. And we do a lot of memes as well. Just two examples there, but we do love a good meme.
Excellent. So we'll come on to what we're going to do in this session, and we want to start straight out by telling you what this session is going to do and what it isn't going to do. So what this session is going to cover is really CV advice for beginners, broadly speaking. That's not to say that all of us don't have something to learn and new things to think about when doing our CVs, but we are taking this from an approach of more an early career professional. And you'll see when we work through our example in the second half of the session, the kinds of things we're including. We'll be talking about what to include on your CV and what order you might want to include it in. We're going to focus on making sure that what you put on your CV adds value to your CV, and we'll talk a bit about what that means as well. We are going to cover some tips of what not to include, and that could be because you don't need to include it, or because it is potentially allowing room for discrimination if you include it, or because, and I put this in the nicest possible way, nobody will care if you include it. So that's where the focus on value comes in. And as I say, in the second half of the session, we'll be doing a build a CV demo, I suppose, with a shared screen as well. So what we are not going to be talking about in this session is some of the other types of CVs that you may have seen around and about. So we aren't going to be talking about skills-based CVs, which is where a CV is really less about chronology and more about a skill. We're not going to be doing a leadership CV, which is where you discuss all of your experience through the kind of lens of your leadership times and how you've used leadership in your roles. We aren't going to be talking about portfolio-based CVs where you might have examples of your work. We're not going to be talking about academic CVs, which can be quite a different beast, a lot more focused on research and publication. We're not really going to talk about application forms and covering letters either, although that will be relevant to some of the things we're going to cover. And we're also not going to be talking about American CVs because they are a bit of a different beast, as we will now explain. Tom.
Yeah, so just on a point of terminology, you may have heard the term CV and also the term resume bandied around, and it's important to be quite clear about what they mean in different contexts. So the word resume is really only used in American English, and what it means is basically what a CV means in British English. In American English, a CV is actually something quite different and quite a lot longer as well. So in the UK usage, a CV is it's a short document that gives an outline of your work. It's a sort of at a glance view of your achievements, your work history, your qualifications that supports an application. In length, it will typically be about 2 pages long, there or thereabouts. And you will tailor it for each application you make. You must tailor it as well. That's really, really important. That term would be described as a resume in American English. But if you were talking about a CV in America, you would be talking about a much longer document running to many, many pages that basically had everything that you've ever done that's remotely connected to your educational or academic professional development, a whole list of things. And there isn't really an analogous term to that in British English. The closest we can get is probably a master CV. And it's quite a good thing to keep a master CV where you can put all of the training you've ever had, every little aspect of every job that you've ever had, because these are things that you're going to forget ultimately. To have somewhere where you can keep that is a useful thing, but you would never ever use that to support a job application. Is this you, Louise? Or
no, it's you.
It's me. So yeah, in this session, it's really important to say that there's no right or wrong answers. People have got different styles and preferences. Some people will say, 1 page max for a CV, which is a minority opinion, but there's still people out there who say that. Most people will say 2 pages maximum. Some people will say 3 pages is fine. We're going to tell you, I think, more about the general sort of expectations that employers have to give you an idea of something that's not going to look like super weird if you submit it to them. And it's important as well that what works for one candidate and one recruiter might not work for another. So the same thing applies, that we're just giving you an overview of the sort of the most normal expectations that recruiters would have with regards to CVs. And we're coming at this from our own perspective. So both Louise and I have got postgraduate degrees, and we've both got around 10 to 15 years experience in the sector, and we're now sort of fully emerged, so to speak, and in the mid-career stage as well. So just to state that that's where we're coming from. And yeah, we're not going to give you any black and whites on this, but we can give you a good idea of the areas in which there's a sort of broad consensus of agreement, and hopefully make your CVs and your job applications as good as they can be.
All right. And I will also add to that, you will see as we go through this, there are areas where Tom and I don't agree, and that will come through when we're doing the demo. There are a lot of personal choices and personal preferences that there is room to make, and we'll be talking around what is kind of the most standard. So we want to start by just establishing what it is that you need your CV for. What does it do for you? There are usually two ways that people will be applying for jobs. You'll be applying with your CV and a covering letter, or via an application form or an application portal that is essentially a form online. Occasionally, some organizations might ask you to do both. You'll be uploading your CV, but still filling in a form. And obviously, we don't advocate for that for employers, because that is duplicating all of the effort for all of us when we're applying for jobs. So broadly speaking, there's two ways that you'll go forward. A covering letter is where you will set out how you meet the person specification for that job. The role of your CV in that application process is to support what you are saying in your covering letter, and to give an at-a-glance overview of the things that you've done that are relevant to your application. So some of that will be your career history, could be your education, could be skills you've developed outside of work, and we'll be talking about all of those elements. And it shows you it shows the employer where you are adding value to what they're looking for, and reiterating those key skills that you are saying that you have. All of us do more in our jobs than you can convey in the format of a CV. So it's important to internalize upfront, your CV is never going to say absolutely everything there is to say about everything you have done. It's a summary, something that gives that overview of what you've done. As we've said before, it's really important that you tailor your CV for the role you're applying for. So you might have a fairly standard 2-page CV, but what will be important is that you go in each time you're needing to use it and just make sure that you're hitting the criteria in the way that the role is describing. So what we're going to do in this session is a general CV, and we'll talk about some of the places where you could tailor it depending on what a role description is asking for. So, for example, if you have 2 sets of experience, one in customer service and one in collections care, you'll focus your CV differently depending on which of those jobs it is that you're applying for. Hopefully that all is very clear. I will say at this point, please feel free to put questions in the chat throughout the session. We might answer some of them as we're going along, or we might save them all for the end, depending on how things are working out. Also feel free to comment if there's something that you do that really works for you, like share that experience with everyone else in the session as well. Because as Tom said, we're not presenting 100% this is the only way to do it. So it'll be really interesting to hear from other people about their experiences as well.
So yeah, on the really most basic level, there's some things that you absolutely must include on your CV. So right at the top, you have your name and contact details. Usually it will be your postal address, an email address, and a phone number. And that really is expected. You'd also have some form of work history, and that could be paid work and it could be voluntary work. And it doesn't necessarily matter about the order in which you present that, as long as you do sort of differentiate what are paid roles and what are voluntary roles as well. And you would normally include, you absolutely would include qualifications too on there. There's some bits which you can also include if and only if it adds value. So some people, like Louise does, I don't personally like to include a personal summary, which gives a sort of paragraph of text quite far towards the top of the CV, which just gives a sort of at a glance view of who you are and what makes you tick and what you're good at. You can have a skills and professional development section as well. But again, it has to add value. So it would only be if you wanted to shout about a key skill that you had that was really relevant to the role you were applying for, or any relevant training courses, memberships of professional bodies, things like licenses as well, driving licenses, forklift truck driving licenses, anything and everything that a role might require. First aid training, languages. If you speak Spanish, that could be quite useful for a visitor service role, but also things like British Sign Language and Makaton. And you can also have a separate section as well for publications and presentations, wherever you have done those. But again, only do those things if it adds value to the role.
Tom, can I ask you a question from the chat? Because I think it's good to bring these things in as they come up. So what do we think around best practice on including a postal address? So Rachel's suggesting that she's been told not to. So what do we think on that?
Well, it's something that I've always done. I think in this session we're going to talk about what not to include, because it can open up discrimination, and I think a postal address has the potential to do that. So that's maybe one reason not to do it as well. Another reason I can think of is a lot of us have found ourselves applying for jobs at other ends of the country, and again that comes back to discrimination. What sort of bias is the recruiter going to have looking at that? If you're applying for a job in Scotland but you're based in Cornwall, are they going to think, oh, they're not really going to make the effort to apply? They shouldn't think that, but people do have these sort of biases. So it's not actually something I've ever really thought about at all. But now it's been raised, I can see the benefits of leaving it off. I think it largely exists there as a legacy of a time before email and mobile phones, when you did actually want people to contact you. And in terms of job applications, a lot of the communication that would happen back in the 90s or early noughties would be formal and in writing. So that's why you'd have a postal address there. But I think now in the 2020s, it is definitely time to revisit that. So thank you for raising it.
Maybe the key question to ask yourself is, does it add value for me to have my address here? Perhaps for some jobs, if you want to prove that you are in the local area and that you might have that local knowledge, that might be particularly beneficial, and sometimes it isn't. So you can kind of make your choice based on that. I would say I've definitely received in my career letters, rejection, physical letters, and that was in the mid coming on late noughties. So some organizations were still going with that tradition quite late, I think, Tom.
So some things of what not to include, like we said, anything that can open up yourself to discrimination, and date of birth is one of those. Photographs as well is definitely something that you shouldn't include. If I was to put a photo of myself as a white man on a job application, there's all sorts of conscious and unconscious biases that could be playing into. So best practice is always not to include photographs. And I think if you did include a photograph, it could potentially get a recruiter's back up, in that it shows a sort of an ignorance of some of the issues facing recruitment and making it fairer as well.
I think just to touch on photos as well, I think something that's quite difficult is in other countries, attaching photos to a CV is 100% all the time practice. So I think this is something in the UK, it is a lot less common, and we would definitely advise that you do not do it. It shouldn't be something that you're doing.
That was why we were sort of keen to make sure, but to say that this session wasn't covering American applications, because they do work rather differently. I can't really comment about Europe or anywhere else, but definitely the advice for this session would be UK specific. Another thing not to include, because it doesn't add value and it takes up space, is references. If a potential employer wants references from you, they will ask for them. You don't need to provide them up front. And a phrase like references available on request it just adds literally nothing, and you've lost a line of text. So why bother? And then there's the issue of gaps as well. And I think when we were developing this session, Louise, we actually didn't reach a conclusion about how best to manage this. About if people have gaps for whatever reason on a CV, how to convey that. And I think the conclusion that we sort of came to was actually the CV is not the best place to sort of try and explain that. Just put down what's there, and if you do need to go into any more detail about anything, the covering letter, personal statement is a place to do that. But I hope we're moving towards a climate in which people feel that they don't have to justify any gaps, because we've all got them, and COVID and the pandemic is a whole massive thing that's happened, which means everybody's going to have a huge gap on their CV from the years 2019, 2020 into 21.
And hobbies.
Yes, unless they add value. I think this is very much the catchphrase of the session. I applied for archives job once, and they asked me at interview about if I had any hobbies that would be relevant to the role. Something about demonstrating manual dexterity, I seem to think, was something that they were keen on, which is a bit weird. But I was like, sometimes I play the guitar, and more geekily make model airplanes. But hey, it's I am a curator at the RF Museum, so. But yeah, if they add value, include them. If not, no.
And Marilyn has pointed out in the chat that there might be some occasions where a photo might be asked for a job. So in some kind of reenactor type roles where they're looking for a Henry VIII and they need a Henry VIII, that could be a time. But really you would want to go with what was being asked for. And if they're asking for a photo, it's okay to ask yourself and to ask them why they need it, because you are choosing to share that with them. So it is, you are allowed to push back if you feel like you're being asked for a photo or any data that could open up to discrimination unnecessarily, I think, as well. I'm gonna pick up on just another question in the chat. As someone had to nip away briefly, someone missed, Tom, what you were saying about CV gaps, and they're just saying, is it best to cover this in your covering letter rather than the CV itself? And that is exactly what we thought was the case. Your CV is about showing value and adding value, so work with what there is instead of trying to address what might be a gap or what isn't there. So yeah, use your describe what you have done, what your volunteering is as experience, because the person in the chat has replied. And if you need to address that gap, then do that in the covering letter or even in interview or later, depending on what happens. So yeah, you don't need to address the gap in your CV is sort of where we've come to on that. I know there are some other questions in the chat, but I'm going to come to them at the end, but I am noting them, so don't worry if we aren't covering it yet. So let's talk a bit around length and formatting of your CV. And as we said, we're presenting a kind of standard that will give you a CV that nobody is going to turn around and go, oh, what is this that they've done? This is sort of a generic thing that should apply. We're suggesting 2 pages is a good benchmark to aim for, with a couple of caveats. Caveat number 1 is that you should do whatever they are asking for in the job application information. So if they're saying you can go up to 3 pages and you feel that you've got 3 pages of good, valuable information about yourself to share, do that. Or if they're asking for 1, it's a push, but try and get your CV down to 1 page. I don't think that's very common. I think 2 pages of CV is by far the most common approach. You might also have more experience and seniority and a lot of roles. And there's a couple of options here. You could go into a longer CV, but even then I would still be trying to keep it as short as you can. The other option is to do your CV instead of chronologically, do a section that is your relevant experience. So you pull out those jobs that are most relevant and do a very short headings only section that describes any jobs that you've done that don't fit, that don't deserve to take up as much space, I think. You need to make your CV clear and readable. And what that means is using a good size of font, 11 or 12, most commonly. Use headings, leave spaces between sections, use standard margins. So you really need to give people space to read what you've written. It can be tempting, and I am definitely guilty of this, of reducing the margins to force everything to fit on 2 pages, but that makes it much more difficult to read, definitely. Also use a font, a sans serif font, or without serif font, such as Arial. They are usually easier to read for most people who would be reading it, but try to keep your font choice, unfortunately, a little bit boring, but the goal is readability and clarity, and that's definitely what you need to think about. As we say there, accessibility and readability are more important than fancy design for the vast majority of jobs. I think there may be some exceptions. If you were going into a particularly design heavy role, you might want to present something more designed. We are not going to be talking about how to do fancy design on your CV in this session. Neither of us are experts in that, but it is something that you can look for more information on if that works for the kind of roles you're applying for. Thinking about language, and this is going to come up again and again, echo back what appears on the job advert. As we phrased it here, recruiters love the sound of their own buzzwords. So whatever phrases they've chosen, make sure that those phrases are represented in what it is that you've written, because really what happens when you do that is that subconsciously the reader sees the things that they were looking for and goes, oh, they must be like us. They must think the same way that we do. And I know that is not good practice, but that is how people work realistically. And that is what they will see when they read that. We recommend saving it in either PDF or doc format. PDF means that it can't be edited, your formatting will all stick there, and doc is the most common format to be able to open, and that's why we suggest that both of those are acceptable. I would agree with Susan in the chat that a PDF probably is the best option, but we think either of those are really okay. And think about what you are naming the file. The person who's recruiting for this job could get hundreds and hundreds of applicants. And if every application is just called CV June 2021, it's going to be very difficult for them to keep track. So do put your name, or at least your surname, part of your name, in the file name so that they can identify what it is that they're looking at. Rachel makes a really good point in the chat that if it is a Word document that you're sending, make sure you don't have any track changes. So make sure you are sending the final draft version 1 instead of the one before that or any of your earlier ones. Make sure you are sending a full final version with none of your changes still in place. And we just wanted to cover briefly, although we're not focusing on this as a whole, but it has come up a bit in the chat as well, is what you can consider cutting when you become more advanced in your career, when you've got more experience and you are able to kind of choose what's best. As I said earlier, you can focus less on the less relevant roles, and you can do that with an other experience section with just a single line entry for, sorry, there's a typo on our slides there, for non-relevant roles. I've just only noticed that typo now, of course. But you can also choose to take off some experience completely. So early on in my working life, I worked in Boots for a while, and I now don't list that on my CV unless it is adding value for me to have it there. But normally I would take that off. Or perhaps any early roles where you've got more better experience later on, that's something you can take off. So if in one of your early roles you delivered school sessions, for example, but now in one of your subsequent roles, you've done much more delivering of school sessions and you've devised school sessions and you've done a lot more in that area, you've already got a role that's really showing that skill to its best. So you can take out much more detail from the previous ones. At a certain point, some of your secondary school level qualifications, we've suggested A levels and GCSEs, but I know we've got people in the chat who said they were from Scotland, so there might be other qualifications at the same kind of level as well that you might want to remove unless they're explicitly asked for. So most of the time your GCSEs do not need to be listed, but occasionally someone might want to might ask in the job description for GCSE level maths and English, and when that is written you will add that back in. In short, anything that doesn't add value for the role you're applying for can be a candidate to be removed when you're making that application. Susan, we're going to come on to your question about how much to include when we're showing the demo CV in a couple of moments. So that will be covered. Marilyn asks, is it okay to say that some early experience oh, sorry, let me read this question again. Is it okay to say about some early experience not on your CV in the covering letter if it is relevant if you have a long career? Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it is okay. I think it would be better if you were talking about something in the covering letter to have it on your CV, but I don't think it's an absolutely necessary thing. And there are valid reasons why you would not do that. So I don't see it as a massive red flag for me. What do you think, Louise?
I agree. I think it's better that your covering letter is referring to things on your CV, but space allowing, I think, yeah, if you need to, I think the question is, if you think it's valuable enough that you're referring to it in your covering letter, does that mean that it is valuable enough to be on your CV and that you need to cut something else instead? I suppose I would turn that question back around instead. If that is key experience that you're describing in that role, then maybe it does need to be on your CV. But I appreciate when you've got a lot of experience, it can be quite difficult to kind of differentiate and make the case for everything being important, I think.
An example where I think it might be relevant is, say you had a retail job years back and you were applying for a museum role that had, say, electronic point of sale, like tills, basically, experience. Now, you wouldn't want to have necessarily have, if it was years ago and you've got all sorts of other experience, a really detailed account of what you did on that Saturday job. But you could have a one-line reference to it on the CV and talk about more about what you specifically did in the covering letter.
And Rachel's added a comment pointing out, actually, it should be on your CV if you're referring to it, because the recruiting manager might be thinking, oh, when was that? And they won't be able to see that on your CV. So that, I think, is a really compelling reason to include it if you can. Okay, so I stopped sharing the slides because we're going to move on to populating a CV. Tom, am I right in thinking that you're going to be pasting into the document?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay, good. I just wanted to check before I bring things up. So let me share another window. Hopefully you can all now see a, oh no, I just clicked on stop sharing by accident. Sorry. You'd think after this long on Zoom, we'd all be excellent at it, but still not always. Okay, so what we have created is a kind of basic template of what a CV could look like. Sorry, hopefully you can still see just the one I'm sharing. Okay, great. I've got a lot of windows open. I just wanted to be sure. And we've sort of outlined the basic sections that we think to include. And I know we talked about whether we should include a personal summary, but we're going to go on the assumption that we do want to include one, but we are going to come back to that at the end rather than doing it first, because the personal summary is kind of the introduction to you. And as I think a lot of us might know, writing the introduction is sometimes a lot easier when you've written everything else first. So we'll come back to that. We're going to start by thinking about experience. So experience, as we talked about earlier, can be your paid experience and your voluntary experience. And we think that you can put those in as a general experience section and just indicate where you were a volunteer, and that is enough. And Tom is going to paste in our kind of draft experience section. And this will answer one of the questions that someone's asked in the chat about how much information to include about each relevant job role. And this is an area where Tom and I had a very in-depth discussion about how many bullet points we felt were acceptable. So I, on my CV, tried to stick to absolutely no more than 4 bullet points per job.
Yeah, and I went a little bit longer, sometimes up to 6. I think what we did agree, though, was when you get to numbers like 8 or 10, that is definitely too many.
I think the person in the chat is saying that a lot in smaller museums, you might be working on a lot of different areas in that role. And I think what you need to do is kind of take a critical eye to which of those things that you did in that role were most important to the role that you're now applying for. So what is crucial that you need to communicate? And I would say that some of my bullet points do certainly take up 2 full lines of content, because when you've done a lot in a small museum, there is a lot to say. But keeping it to bullet points that are readable, I think is quite important. We have suggested that the experience should be starting at the most recent and going backwards by the end date of the employment or the voluntary role. So what we've got here is we've got what you're currently doing. So 2019 to present, for example, at the top. We've got something that overlapped a bit but ended in 2020, and something that again overlapped and ended in 2019.
So, I'm just going to talk here as well about how we talk about the dates as well. I think putting a month in there is good, because this is the museum sector, and we all have had short-term contracts. So that's probably the best thing to do. In terms of the actual day of the month that you started, I don't think it adds anything, and it just makes it look a bit more cluttered.
Yeah, absolutely. At minimum, you need the year, but the month year is also really common as well, definitely. So what we've done here is so these are all, this is a fictional person with fictional experiences in fictional organizations, because we didn't want to get bogged down in specific real detail. So what's key is that we are looking at the most important bullet points for each job, and we have imagined that they're looking to apply for a job in a learning role, specifically focusing on kind of informal learning with families at another organization that they're looking for. So what we've done is we've written about the experience in things they've delivered, and including numbers and things you can quantify is often quite important in CVs. So what we could have said here is that, experience delivering curriculum-based sessions. But what can be quite useful to a recruiting manager is how many, how often, to how many children, how many people attended the sessions, how many people attended the events that you were organizing, so that people can get a sense of the scope. And that is especially true if you've ever managed a budget. or a team, it can be quite useful to put the numbers on there. So how many people did you manage? How much money were you managing in that role? All of those things are quite key to kind of add value to the experience that you're saying. And we haven't written about the voluntary experience in a different way to how we've written about the paid experience. You're still stating the facts of what you've done. And there's a lot of options here for how you could sort of edit the experience if different things needed to be focused on. So for example, we're imagining this person is applying for a role where they're going to be delivering learning. So we've written that they have provided short talks about artworks to groups. If you were applying for a role that was asking for some research skills, instead of saying you gave talks, you could say that you researched talks to give to the public using XYZ sources, or keeping XYZ things in mind when you were doing that research. So it's about how you pull out what's crucial and reflect that language. And the same goes for things like policies and procedures. So we've pulled out a few here that you might experience as a retail assistant that could also be asked for in a role description. So if a role description is asking that you have understanding of health and safety, or GDPR, or safeguarding, those are all things to mention when you're describing your experience in those roles. So if when you were a learning assistant, you were also a safeguarding officer, you can make sure that you put that exactly in that description. Tom, anything to add on experience?
I don't think so, other than try and front load the most relevant experience to the top of the bullet points as well. Because when people are marking job applications, they don't spend a lot of time on each application. You hear some horrific statistics going around, like, no more than a minute, which is really bad. But it's the reality that we're up against. So you do need to sort of make sure you catch their eye first with the most relevant stuff for the role that you're applying for.
Let's move on now to qualifications. So we're imagining that this imaginary person has a few qualifications to include, and Tom is going to paste those in for us so you can see how we have chosen to describe that. I think something to keep in mind is, depending on where you are in your career and how much you've got to say in your CV, you might want to add more information about some of the things you did in your qualification. And something I did, especially early on in my career, is I talked about some of the relevant things I did in my degree. So I did my third year project was about museums, and it was a research project. So I made a note of that underneath the heading to say that this was something I researched, because that is a way that I had gathered museum experience at that point in my career. And you'll see that we've also chosen to summarize that they have 9 GCSEs, grades A to C, including maths and English. And that can be a good way to save some space. There's usually no need to list every subject unless it is specifically asked for, or you're trying to prove something in the role description using a qualification that you have. For example, if they were looking for the ability to speak French and you had an A-level or a GCSE in French, that might be worth including at your own risk. You want to make sure you still can speak French if your GCSEs were a little while ago. But that's that's a reason you might want to specifically add a qualification. The other thing to keep in mind about qualifications is that they might not all be formal, but they should be accredited. So for example, if you've got a project management qualification, then you can add that in here as well. So for example, if you had Prince 2 practitioner status, that would be a qualification that you could add. Or any other qualifications that you've done where really they were formal is the key difference there. Formal or accredited is what we're looking for. Anything to add on qualifications, Tom?
I don't think so, other than it's the same, it's reverse order. So the most recent goes to the top, and yeah, so on. So forth.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll come on to the skills and professional development section. So this section, you could be called a lot of different things depending on the kind of content it is that you're including. And Tom is going to paste some ideas of what you might include there.
I'm just going to go on to the
let me scroll
page.
down. I forgot that only I could control the scroll because you're in a different place. So we've called this section skills and professional development, and it is just a bit of a space where you can keep quite a few different things. So some of the things that might go in here would be training courses that are not accredited qualifications. You might want to include some key skills that it's hard to make room for elsewhere, and you can tailor this obviously to what it says in the job description. Some things like first aid, and other licenses, perhaps driving license. If you have one, that might land here more easily than anywhere else. And also professional memberships are something that can be quite useful here as well. So what we've put here is some of the examples of that. So for example, a DBS check, that you're a member of GEM, that you've this person's got a sign language qualification, they've done sign language and they've got a Macathon as well, first aid at work, and then a summary line, which often is asked for, but can be quite hard to shoehorn into a CV, something about IT skills. So excellent IT skills, including Microsoft Office programs. And that might seem really obvious and kind of like it's not adding value, but there will be a lot of places, a lot of job applications where that is a line in the person specification, and you need to be able to get a tick in that box. So adding this bullet point is adding value to your CV. One of the questions in the chat is, can you add future learn courses?
Yes, and I think that's probably the better place to put them because they're not accredited, to my knowledge.
Most it's a bit complicated.
They can be if you pay, I think.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Tom. If you've done future learn courses, this is the place to put them. Make sure they are relevant to what it is you're applying for. And it's the same with short courses and workshops. What I normally do is I pull out a couple of things, and I have a line that that goes, recent training attended includes, and then I list a few key things that are relevant to the job. So at the moment, I think I've got listed GDPR, diversity and equality training, and something else that I've forgotten. And those are a mixture of 2-hour workshops, 1-hour mandatory training that I've been on at my workplace, and sort of full day things. And so Fiona, as you're saying in the chat, I think it doesn't matter about the length. What matters is that you're putting in something there that is relevant. So that is the key thing to keep in mind. And especially if you were questioned about it and you could say something substantial, or if you're referring to it in your covering letter or elsewhere in your application, that's really key. So if the way that you're showing that you can do something in the job, that's why you would want to mention that there.
If we can return briefly to the topic of master CVs as well, I'd just like to say that they're a good idea, especially for putting down details of any training courses that you've been on, because they are especially easy to forget. And I've certainly tried to recreate a list of training courses attended by going back through my emails, which is a long and tortuous process. So you're just saving yourself a job.
I would also add, of course, if you are keeping a CPD log, that is the absolute gold standard of keeping a good track of what you're doing in terms of your professional development, so that you can then pull out the most relevant things to include here. I'm not going to talk about CPD logs in any more detail, but if you want to know, I know Gem have some resources about that on the website. Someone's asking if you are currently studying any courses. Yeah, absolutely. Include something you're currently studying. So if you are doing a qualification or currently on a course, The example, Tom's looking a bit skeptical at me, but the example here is the GEM Foundation course, which is something that is an ongoing course that you are committed to over a period of time. And I think that is something that you could include.
So I wasn't I wasn't looking skeptical.
Oh.
I think it's absolutely fine to include stuff that you're currently doing. And the convention is just to say expected to graduate or to complete or finish or whatever, and then give a date, a month and a year.
Another question in the chat is, if the training courses are relevant but old, 10 years, should you include them? My first question would be, has that thing changed in the last 10 years? If that thing hasn't changed in the last 10 years, I think you could make a case for including it. I think a lot of things probably have, but sort of, or is it a particularly notable training course? I think those are the two reasons you might want to include something that is 10 years old, but I would say go with caution if that's what you're thinking of doing. Anything to add, Tom?
No, I think that's very sound.
All right, excellent. We've added a section here for publication and presentations, and we're imagining that this person has published something in the GEM case studies. This is not real. We have made it up, so don't go looking for it, because it was not published in case studies 26 remote learning that I looked in. So this is something that's made up. But if you have published anything, you can put that here. That can include online material as well. So if there are blogs relevant to the role and to your working life that you've published, you might want to consider putting those in, I think, as well, especially if they're published on particularly on like a sector website. So if you've written something for the GEM website or the Museums Association website or Engage or any others, I think those can be useful things to include.
Or if you run your own blog as well, which is, amassed a following, then by all means put that on. That's a completely legitimate thing to do. And then you've not only written for it, you're also the editor and webmaster. So, you're taking 3 boxes.
Absolutely. If you've forgotten the year of a course, is it okay to leave the date off rather than guess?
Probably better to do that than to guess, yeah. I don't know, actually.
I think you're fine either way. The main thing is, if they asked you questions about that course, could you answer them if you didn't put the date on? And I think if the answer is yes, go for it. We haven't got too long left, so I'm going to come back to the personal summary. So we've sort of imagined some things that this person has done, and now we're going to imagine the personal summary for this person. When you're writing your personal summary, the key thing to do is answer 4 questions in about a paragraph of text. So, who are you? What are your key skills that relate to the job? What value are you bringing to the job? And what are you looking for? So Tom is going to paste in our example for this person. Now, I'm not going to say that this is the only thing that can be written about this person, or that it is the best thing that can be written. Your personal summary is going to be really personal to you and what you want to say about yourself and what's important. So what we're suggesting is a passionate advocate for Key Stage 1 learning in museums. I bring an enthusiastic and approachable style to all I undertake. I'm a trained first aider with extensive customer service skills. I'm looking for a role where I can develop my informal learning skills and utilize my administrative skills to open up museum learning to a new audience. So what we've done there is we've said who they are, a passionate advocate for Key Stage 1 learning in museums. What are their key skills that relate to the job? They're enthusiastic, approachable, a trained first aider, extensive customer service skills, and administrative skills. What value do they bring? The same. They're enthusiastic, they're approachable, they're already first aid trained, so you won't have to pay for them to get their first aid qualification. They've got customer service skills. And what are you looking for? They're looking for something to develop their informal learning skills and to use some of their existing skills to achieve this goal of opening up museum learning to new audiences. Personal summaries are difficult, and as Tom said in the slides, they aren't essential. It's about what adds value to you. anything to add, Tom?
No, I don't think so. Like Louise said, you don't have to have one. I don't, but up to you, really. So we've got 2 minutes now.
I've got a couple of questions from
questions.
the chat that I want to come back around to.
Yep.
So I was advised by my university careers service that it was a good idea to send out a CV and cover letter to museums speculatively, as in not in response to a job advert, just saying you're interested in working there. Would you agree?
I believe that might have worked in the past, but I just don't think that happens these days.
I'm inclined to agree. I think the way that recruitment works is a lot more structured now than it was in the past. And I think if you do apply speculatively, you're extremely unlikely to get anything from doing that. So I would suggest that it isn't necessarily something to spend a lot of time doing. So yeah, I think your university is probably giving slightly out of date advice, I think. And that is industry dependent. In museums, I don't think that's effective, but there might be other industries where that is more effective. But I don't think in museums and heritage that is the case. I'm just seeing in the chat if there's any questions that I have missed. I'm just going to stop my screen share because it will be slightly easier. If I have missed your question in the chat, feel free to add it quickly at the bottom. And that's taken us to our full hour. So we've really done a quite speedy run through of everything. We have got a couple more minutes. We can answer some more questions from the chat if anyone wants to hang on and ask them. So what about highlighting the most relevant parts of your jobs on your CV What about highlighting the most relevant parts of your jobs on your CV? Do you think it's worth adding any additional highlights, Tom?
As in actually highlighting them with colour, I would say that's not expected in bold. Possibly keywords in bold could work. Yeah, I again, I don't think it's necessarily the expected thing to do, but I don't think it's necessarily going to make your CV stand out as odd if you did do that. And it does tie in with what we said about parroting back, echoing the language of the recruiter.
Mm-hmm. Marilyn, if we've misunderstood the question, do put in the chat what you wanted if we've not quite grasped the question. Another question that's come in is, I've just been rejected from a job and managed to get some feedback on why I wasn't selected. They mentioned that I had a couple of jobs that were irrelevant, but if I left them off, it would leave gaps on my CV. What do you think would be best to do in this situation?
In that situation, you can always include them, but just don't give a breakdown of bullet points of what you did. So you're saying where you worked, but it's literally just one line.
I think the other option there is, if you've got quite a lot of experience, is to have a section of experience that is named relevant experience, where you're listing those jobs you've done that are most relevant, and then another section below that that is called other experience, where you literally just give a one-liner of that job. So you might just say learning assistant, Anytown Museum, dates, and that is all that you say about that job. So it shows that you don't have gaps, but you don't waste space describing a job that you don't need to.
I would say that no job is irrelevant though, and I worked in retail for Morrison's for many years, and I think even in my latest job application, I included that, even though it was, getting on for 9 years ago, because I still did things there that I did nowhere else, and it was actually a great place for developing certain skills. So never discount transferable skills.
So if there are any other questions, please put them in the chat very quickly. But what I will say is, what will happen with this session afterwards? So it's been recorded by Jem. That recording will be available to you as having come to this session fairly quickly. I don't want to commit Jessica to an immediate turnaround, but I think fairly soon that will be sent to you. And then what we're also going to be doing is me and Tom will be writing up a blog version of all of the advice that we've given with examples and some more content that will be published on GEM and on Fair Museum Jobs. So you'll also get a link to that sent round to you when we've written that. So all of what we've talked through, but in a written form that you'll be able to, sorry, something just fell over, that you'll be able to refer back to later. So don't worry if you are struggling to remember everything we've gone through. I know it was really quick, but there will be a lot resources to follow on this afterwards. And thank you, Jessica, who will be sending the recording out at the start of next week. So thank you everyone for coming. We're so pleased that you decided to spend some of your evening with us. And I'm glad that you're feeling reassured and got some useful tips out of it and that people are finding it really helpful. It's brilliant that you have got what you needed. And if you do have any other questions, feel free to send them in because we can address them in the blog, even if we can't answer them in the chat right now. So if there's a quick question you want to chuck in before you go, please do, and we will address those in the blog. We will be saving the chat, but of course it will be anonymous.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
All right, thanks so much. And if there's no further questions, on with your evenings, everybody. Thanks for joining us.